All right, thank you very much for having me. So this work here is joint with my colleague Alex Brown and our student Jacob Forrest Williams, who is on the market. And those of you who are hiring in public or experimental should hire him. He's really great. This paper is actually very closely related to what Bob just presented, which makes my early job very easy. I think we had the same motivating example in mind, the notion of someone who is a high earner who chooses to volunteer their time anyway. But I think what you'll find is that our papers are complements and not substitutes. There are lots of reasons why people volunteer rather than give money. There are sort of these self-investment reasons: prestige, networking, signaling, cute girl at Habitat for Humanity, whatever it is. You may get enjoyment from the actual volunteering activity. So you're a lawyer, but you like doing some carpentry, so you go volunteer at Habitat for Humanity with the cute girl. And also the possibility of greater warm glow from the volunteering, the act of volunteering itself. And so our experiments normalize these first two things. So basically, we strip out all of the self-investment type stuff. There's no attractive people, there's no prestige, there's no networking, and the tasks are identical. In a similar vein to stuffing envelopes, though we have an even more mundane task. So our questions are whether subjects prefer working for charity, that is giving time, versus donating an equivalent amount, everything else equal. If so, by how much? We also nest this question about solicitation, whether a greater solicitation might be driving our results. And then we kind of bring it all together and ask whether time and money are substitutes or complements. And we also got curious at this point and started varying the relative wages of these two jobs. This is a new addition to this paper, and looked to see whether people correctly substitute towards the more efficient activity to maximize their impact, very similar to this price of impurity that Bob was just talking about. So the answers are yes, yes they do prefer to give their time by a lot. So extra solicitation really doesn't explain most of this result. Time and money turn out to be substitutes in our paper, much as they did in Bob's. And people do not completely shift towards the more efficient method of maximizing their donative impact. So we'll start in media res. We'll flash forward to one particular subject from our experiment, a male Texan political science major who chose off a list of 10 charities to potentially work for or donate to Doctors Without Borders, and faced a 75-minute experiment in which he manipulated sliders around at either 3 cents per slider for every slider he worked for, designated as working for charity, or 4 cents to himself. Now he could switch as often as he wanted, whenever he wanted, and at the end of the experiment he could also donate out of his personal earnings. And this particular eager beaver completed over 1,400 sliders in our hour and 15-minute task. And he chose to earn $42.63 at 3 cents a slider for charity. So he earned 100% of his earnings for charity. Now he could have made almost $57 for himself and then either given it all to charity or given the exact same amount to charity and kept $14 for himself. So this would be someone with a very high price of impurity here. So this also, I'll go into more details about our experiment, but this kind of gives you the framework of what we're looking at. And of course, this is, while not our only person who gave all of their earnings to charity, it is an extreme example. So the experimental evidence on warm glow is extensive. Some of it is sitting in this room. I'm going to gloss over this, especially since we just got an excellent example of a very recent paper on that subject. There's also some evidence on solicitation. If you recall, I mentioned that I'll look at that as well. I don't know if I trust these last two papers here, but it's certainly, the evidence seems to suggest that solicitation has an impact on people's willingness to donate. And then volunteering versus donations, they're particularly from observational data, very mixed evidence, because of course it's very difficult to identify how much is being driven by unobserved altruism and how much is actually substitutes versus complements. Though there is this interesting paper where people who are asked to think about how much they earn per hour end up choosing to volunteer less. So our theoretical model, which I'll sketch out very briefly, is the same theoretical model that, that Bob was working off of. It includes preferences for personal consumption and for leisure, and also warm glow from the amount of money you give, separately from the opportunity cost of volunteering, that is the cost to you of giving to the charity, and then finally from the total impact of the gift. So those three things are sort of modeled separately in there. We also, and in this case, we're going to assume for now that warm glow is equal from donations and volunteering as we think about what falsifiable predictions we can come up with to test in the lab. We also add the impact of solicitation. We add sort of a parameter that suggests that giving should be increasing in solicitation, which is a pretty reasonable assumption until you get to the point where you're constantly having people knock on your door every 3 seconds. So the main predictions that we extract from here is that giving should be non-decreasing in solicitation. So sort of the more intensely we solicit you here, the more you should give. If wages are equal, then monetary donations and volunteering should come up with about the same amount of value of giving in this case. And if wages are unequal, then donations should be from the high wage activity, because the warm glow from the two should be the same, and the total impact of the gift also matters. So that's kind of what we'll have in the back of our heads as we move forward with this. So this experiment was conducted at the Economic Research Lab at Texas A&M, and we ended up with about 414 subjects across all of our treatments. In the very beginning, we asked them to choose a charity for which they would work for. There were local charities and national or international charities. There were charities with different, very broad scopes, so everything from taking care of people with disabilities to animal shelters and so on. We're also looking at some questions about people's preferences for giving to local versus non-local charities as we do this. The important thing is the choices here don't seem to affect, or the way we frame the choices here didn't affect any of the other results that I'm going to present. All right, so our subjects performed a 75-minute slider task. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this, though I think most of you probably are, basically what you're trying to do is get that little slider thingy over so that the number on the left matches the number on the right. As you saw from subject 272, you can do a lot of these once you get into the groove. We probably should have paid them less. But once you do one of these, it disappears. You get some money banked either to yourself or to the charity, depending on the setup of that particular treatment, and you can move on. You can move on to the next one. There's no limit to how many of these you could have done. You could take breaks, and we had an option for people to take breaks and so on. No one took a break. As it turns out, we were paying just so much above the prevailing wage in the greater Bryan College Station area that people really extracted as much as they could out of us, though many of them then turned around and chose to donate that to charity. So we sort of have five basic conditions here. So we start with the absolute simplest one. So donate at end, DE. You just donate your earnings at the end of the experiment. You work for 75 minutes, you earn some money, and then at the very end we ask you how much, if anything, would you like to donate to the charity that you chose at the very beginning of the experiment. So that's sort of a baseline treatment. And then we say, well, what if we add a little prompt to remind you? So imagine a billboard as you drive home. And so you might think to yourself, oh, Special Olympics, that's something I care about because I chose it at the very beginning, and I see the Special Olympics billboard, but it's not actionable. You can't do anything about it until you get home and actually decide to do it. We saw a paper this morning about the notion of inertia that I think is related to this idea here. So it's exactly the same as the donated end, except we just have a little prompt that reminds you that you selected that particular charity. Then we added what we might think of as actionable solicitation. So at any point during the experiment, you could pause for a moment and give as much as you wanted up to your total earnings at that point. So you could give as often as you wanted, as much as you wanted. For the most part, I should note that the people who gave in this treatment, almost all of them, with the exception of one person who, when she would reach the end of a page of sliders, would give 10% of her earnings. Almost every single person gave in the last 2 or 3 minutes of this. So almost all of this was, the behavior of giving here was very, very similar to the way we had sort of restrained their behavior in the previous one. And what you might think of this is, it suggests that maybe people don't get extra warm glow from lots of little donations, so that there's maybe some additivity going on here. So finally, we have our really stylized volunteering treatment. So here, your effort is accruing directly to the charity. So you press a little button and it says you're working for the charity, and money accrues in the charity's bank. You can switch back and forth a million times if you want. You could alternate sliders throughout the entire experiment. The median number of switches, I think conditional on people who switched at least once, was 5. And they chose which one they started. And so they could start either, they made the decision to either start working for themselves or start working for the charity. And so you'll notice that if the way we framed the model is the case, then you should see that continual, donate, and toggle should have the same outcome. That they're effectively the same treatment. And then finally, what we added was the possibility of volunteering for the charity throughout the experiment, and then giving money at the end. And so now you have the ability to reach the end of the experiment and also donate money in the same way as you would have really in conditions 1 or 2. And so these are the 5 treatments. And in this case, number 5, we also played around with the wage ratio of earnings for yourself versus earnings for charity, or whether the two were the same. Okay, so this is a continual reminder. And just to give you a sense, this is what a page of sliders look like. You can see the earnings at the top up there. You're sort of monitoring your earnings, so you have very good information about how much you've earned. And it just says you will be able to donate to the Special Olympics. Looking at the continual donate, and the difference in font size is entirely an artifact of not stretching this thing correctly. But you see the same type of reminder. You can see how much have you donated to Feeding America so far, and you can stop at any time and enter an amount in there. And finally, the toggle, there's just that button, switch to work for charity. You can switch back as many times as you want. So work for yourself or work for charity. So our predictions here is that continual reminder and continual donate, which provide the non-actionable and actionable solicitation, we should see greater donation with greater intensity of solicitation. On the warm glow side, volunteering and donated earnings should be equivalent. And so we should see that continual donation and toggle are the same. Alternatively, if there's greater warm glow from volunteering, we should see more donative behavior in toggle than in continual donate. And in terms of substitution, allowing for gifts of time and money, if these things are perfect substitutes, should not lead to any additional giving in this case. And if we shift the wage ratio towards either giving oneself or giving by charity, people should do the efficient thing to maximize the donative impact to the charity itself. Okay, so I'm going to present results very basically. So here we've just got 3 margins. Did you give it all? Did you give more than $1, so more than a token donation? What I should note is a lot of people gave their change. So they ended up with $27.63, and they gave 63 cents. And whether you gave more than $5, so what we would think of as really a pretty substantial gift. And so we can start by comparing donated end, the blue bar, to continual reminder, the red bar, and you can see that they are basically identical. So that non-actionable solicitation doesn't really seem to have an impact. But if we add the actionable solicitation, the greater intensity, greater ease of giving from continual donate, you can see that a far larger proportion of people give it all, and they tend to give more substantial amounts, even though, as I said, they tended to give right at the end of the experiment. They weren't giving as they went through when we looked at the actual time pattern of givings. And then if we look at the purple bar, which is the toggle condition, the sort of pure volunteering condition, we see that people are substantially more likely to give anything. They are substantially more likely to give more than a token amount, and they are really far more likely to give a lot more money. And we considered a number of alternative explanations here. It's not because giving in continual donation is harder somehow. So first of all, as I mentioned, nearly everyone who gives just does so once at the very end of the experiment. We looked to see whether there was a drop in productivity in the minutes in which people were either making a switch or doing this donation, and they were pretty much equivalent. It's not because, we don't think it's because people sort of miscalculated. They kind of volunteered too much in the beginning and then decided that they should pull it back somehow. The probability of volunteering towards the end of the experiment was pretty similar to at the beginning of the experiment, so it's not some sort of miscalculation or adjustment. And it's not some sort of default, because if you recall, people had to decide whether they started in working for themselves or working for charity. We didn't start them in the working for charity condition. Maybe they just didn't notice. So they had to make an active decision. Now, when we add the I guess, lighter blue bar there, that's toggle plus the continual reminder, the 0.3, 0.3, that's an equal wage ratio. So you earn 3 cents per slider, whether you're working for yourself or working for charity. And then at the end, you can also donate, money. And what we see is that now almost 85% of people donate something, right? So the probability of giving anything is higher, but the probability of giving more than a token amount is not higher. And these results are fairly new to us. We only did this in the last month or so. But our hypothesis is that basically what we did was induce people to give their change. Now they were able, the person who had earned $27.63 for themselves could now get rid of that 63 cents. And that's where you see this 12 percentage point difference in probability of giving anything, but really not much of a difference in giving a more substantial amount. So then we got to thinking, well, it seems like people aren't giving any more when we give them the opportunity to do this other thing. Let's see how much they prefer giving time by. Though actually, before I do that, this is a pretty similar graph to the previous one. What it does, though, is these are people who made some donation at all. So this is conditional on donating. What percent of your earnings did you donate? And so what you can see here is a very similar pattern to what I showed you before. Token gifts are really low in the toggle condition, but as a proportion of people who gave anything, those token gifts come back up when we give the opportunity to give money. So it really seems like we induce these kind of marginal givers who may have been motivated by nothing more than not wanting change in their pocket. I think we may have identified the disutility of coins in this treatment. So then we asked, well, what was the mix when we varied the price ratio? And so these three treatments here, the first one is equal wages. The second one, as you might guess, is higher earnings for yourself. So you earn 4 cents for yourself or 3 cents for the charity. And in the last one, you can earn 3 cents for yourself or 4 cents for the charity. And the y-axis is what percent of your total earnings did you donate, and then we broke it into the percent of your total earnings that you donated from volunteering and from money. And you can see the differences in the percent given are not very large. They're not statistically significant across this, but the mix is pretty different. So people have these very strong preferences for giving time when the two are equivalent. But when the wages are stronger for, or when the wages are more meaningful for working for themselves and then donating that money, there's still about half of the money comes from volunteering. So again, strong evidence for the price of impurity that Bob was talking about. And then when we shift it, we don't get perfect movement over to pure volunteering, but this again may be driven by people who are giving their change. So that's a sort of money at the end. This certainly, it's about 10% of the amount comes from monetary donations. It's probably just people rounding off. So we view this as nice evidence of not just the substitutability of time and money, but really strong preferences for giving time, even in this incredibly stylized environment, right? That's the really fascinating thing about this. And people who do experiments were always terrified that you've done something wrong as you go through it, and that, or it's too simple, it's too subtle, as Bob was saying earlier. We were convinced people were going to figure this out, and all we were going to find was people understand this. But it turns out people really, really like to give their time. They really have preferences for that. So as I've been saying, people have strong preferences to earn directly for the charity, which you might think of as a stylized version of volunteering. These preferences are still exhibited even with a large wage differential favoring working for themselves and donating the money. We found that this actionable solicitation increases donative behavior, which possibly has some implications about advertising for charities. And if you don't have your hand out while you're promoting your charity, it may not really have much of an impact. And that gifts of time and money appear to be substitutes in this case, which is in line with the presentation we just saw. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions. Alec?
You summed up the number of hours
So the best, and this is purely back, so we know we've got, what, about $200 billion in giving from individuals, roughly. And I want to say that someone worked it out from the American, it might have even been us, from the American Time Use Survey, number of hours people claim to volunteer, though when you look at the breakdown, what counts as volunteering is not necessarily things that we might necessarily, people could argue over whether this constitutes volunteering or not, and does the transit time to the volunteering activity count or not. And it works out, if I recall correctly, to be roughly the same amount of value if you multiply it by the median wage. But again, you're making a lot of assumptions as you do that. So roughly the same value with a lot of caveats in there. Is there? People had to choose. People had to choose how they started. They could toggle as many times as they wanted. How often do they toggle? I think the median number of toggles was 5, and that may be conditional on people who toggled at least once. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it wasn't like people were toggling constantly. So five switches on average in 75 minutes. So that's a really, really interesting point, and one of the things we're hoping to do is actually formalize that and have people pre-commit in some future treatments, pre-commit to a certain amount of volunteering or a certain amount of donations, or possibly some non-linear, 10% of my first $10, 20% of my next amount of dollars. It's certainly possible. We just didn't see we didn't see people say volunteering a lot in the beginning, locking in an amount, and then switching entirely to giving. Though, like I said, I think that looking at pre-commitment would be really, really interesting.
Last question, maybe before Alex goes. Yeah. Or when you're
Sure.
Do you have a sense they put different effort when they play for themselves?
So excellent question. That was the initial impetus for this experiment, the very early going. Wanted to see whether people worked harder for themselves or for charity. And in the end, as Catherine puts it, the Texan work ethic always wins out, and people just seemed to work equally hard for themselves and for charity. So we turned our attention to some of the other hypotheses that we were looking to test. All right. Well, thank you very much.